Good evening. Welcome back to Down with the Crown, Part 4. I invite you to take a moment, settle into your chair, maybe close your eyes, take a deep breath, and join me in the bracha for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. The exciting conclusion. Down with the Crown, Part 4 of 4. The crowns are cast down. So first, some review. Session 1, we began beginning of the monarchy. In the book of Judges, in the days of the judges before there were kings, we had the quote, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as they pleased." And it seemed to be a problem for the book of Judges that was the case. And Samuel, one of the last judges, gives a warning to the people. The day will come when you cry out because of the king whom you yourselves have chosen, and Hashem will not answer you on that day. That's just a snippet of Samuel's bigger warning about all the things that the king will do, like acquire your horses and your children and all your money and all your land, etc. But the day will come when you cry out because of the king whom you yourselves have chosen, and Hashem will not answer you on that day. And in session 1, we also learned that King Saul, the first king of Israel, was not the best king. He only reigned for about 2 years because picking a leader based on height is not a great idea, even though we still do it today. Session 2, we talked about David and Solomon, the golden age, the united monarchy, when all the tribes were together. And we learned that the golden age was not so precious and idyllic. We learned that good kings don't murder Uriah the Hittite, like David had done. And good kings don't let their kids run amok, like David did. Good kings don't break all the rules for kings in Deuteronomy, like Solomon managed to. Every single one, except maybe the Torah. The text didn't say anything about that, but went back to Egypt for horses, acquired lots of possessions, married foreign women, worshipped foreign gods, the whole 9 yards. We also had a conditional divine promise given to David and Solomon. Your line on the throne of Israel shall never end. And the condition being, if you and your descendants keep all the commandments, which David and Solomon managed to break several of the 10 commandments. I think they managed to break all but like 2 or 3 of them between the 2 of them. So this conditional divine promise of this eternal line of kings was always on shaky ground from the start. In session 3, when bad kings happen to good people, or a house divided, we had the divided monarchy. We had Israel in the north, the 10 tribes, Judah in the south, with the 1, 2, or 3 tribes, depending on how you count, and if Benjamin counts or not, and if the Levites count or not. And in Israel in the north, there were short dynasties and several coups. And I think the last 5 or 6 kings are nothing but a sequence of one king gets overthrown militarily by the next. Welcome, Barbara. In session 3, we talked about Jeroboam and his great sin that caused the whole nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, to sin, setting up golden calves in the towns of Bethel in the south of the kingdom and Dan in the north. And that just characterized the whole kingdom, its entire 200-ish year span. In Judah, there were some good kings and some bad kings, and all the bad kings were involved with idol worship in some way, shape, or form. And the sequence was often bad king, good king, bad king, good king. But towards the end, it just turns into nothing but bad kings, as we will see. And we did talk about Israel falling to the Assyrians and getting carted off in about 720 BCE. We also talked about the divided story. We have the Book of Kings and the Book of Chronicles who look at the history and tell it a little differently. Kings being politics and prophets, Chronicles being about liturgy and Levites in their like special focuses. They differ on the best king ever, Josiah versus Hezekiah. King says Josiah for destroying Jeroboam's calves and all the other forms of idolatry in the entire territory. Chronicles says Hezekiah for fixing the temple and reuniting the people, which shows us what Kings and Chronicles were really worried about the most. Kings was worried about idolatry and correct worship in that way. Chronicles was worried about having the temple together and having the people be a united people together and having correct worship in that way. Both about correct worship ultimately, but what they're focused on is different. And so we come to the end. Down comes the crown. Israel, going just a bit more into what happened when the kingdom of Israel fell. So the history piece, Hoshea was king in Samaria. He had overthrown the previous king. He became king. He irritated his Assyrian overlord, not just once, not just twice, but several times, and it turned out to be one too many. So Assyria was a strong empire at this time, and Israel was sort of like a vassal state. They paid tribute in exchange for the protection of the king and protection from the king of Assyria, sort of like the way that the Bab has worked with protection money. But since Hoshea did not pay up, the Assyrian army arrived, took charge, and deported the people en masse. And outsiders are brought in by the Assyrians to live in the land. That's just the history piece. The theology piece is interesting. This happened because the Israelites sinned against Hashem, their God. They rejected all the commandments of Hashem, their God. They made molten idols for themselves, 2 calves, not just 1, 2 golden calves, and bowed down to all the host of heaven. God afflicted them and delivered them into the hands of plunderers, and finally God cast them out from God's presence. The theology here is that God has a presence in this land, and the people, through misbehavior, through egregious, gross misbehavior, became unworthy of that and got thrown out, which is a difficult theology for me to accept and for most people in the modern day. And you can see the logic in the history of exactly what happened. Hoshea irritating the Assyrian overlord, and finally, and the overlord saying, you know what, I'm putting my foot down on you. And then we have this theological interpretation of why it happened. Now, I wonder, in this storytelling, in the Book of Kings, which part came first, the theology idea or the history? Because based on what I know about the Book of Kings, I suspect it's the history, and the theology, they're trying to explain why it happened and why it was justified. because it could not have been an unjust thing that the people got carted off. Clearly, it had to have been for a good reason. And there was great reason. They had 2 golden calves, not just one, meaning that they were at least twice as bad as the people who came out of Egypt and were waiting for Moses at Sinai, got bored, got impatient, and made a golden calf. This theology also gets turned around in that same chapter and pointed back at Judah. The author of the Book of Kings turns that theology back on Judah. The people in Judah had shrines and sacred poles and worshipped all the host of heaven and bowed down to foreign gods, just like they did in Israel. The only thing is they did not have golden calves. They had the temple instead, which was the correct place to go to worship, according to the theology of the writers of the Book of Kings. But the people of Judah are doing the same thing as the people of Israel were doing, so they're going to merit the same end. And there's a lot of foreshadowing that happens there that isn't really foreshadowing, it's authorial commentary that comes in 2 Kings 17 and lays out doing these things, all this idol worship, all these practices that are abhorrent to God, get you exiled from the land. So the Book of Kings appears to have been written partly during the time of the kings and partly during the exile. And this theology coming in at the end to make everything nice and pretty may have been one of those last things that gets added to the story. It might have been something that there was like a semblance of it there beforehand, maybe especially about the golden calves, but when it gets finally redacted, finally edited to its form that we have today, it was probably during the exile. And in Judah, we do get a last straw. And that last straw is Manasseh, or Manasseh, if you want the traditional English transliteration, son of Hezekiah. Manasseh led the people astray to do greater evil than the nations that Hashem had destroyed before the Israelites. God gave them this promise, gave the people of Israel this promise of this land, and said, I'm going to destroy the people who are in it because of their abominable practices. And Manasseh is there leading the people to do worse than the people who God cast out before them. Manasseh undid everything good Hezekiah had done in the Book of Kings, and then went further. Another line from 2 Kings 21, the quotes here are all from the same chapter. They're a little bit jumbled verse-wise. So, moreover, Manasseh put so many innocent persons to death that he filled Jerusalem with blood from end to end. Which is a horrifying description. And we've seen that sort of leadership in the world in the last century, when a strong man decides to have a purge and purge the government of anyone who disagrees with him. Stalin probably was the most egregious example of this, using the euphemism liquidating so many people for disagreeing with him at all. So Manasseh, Hezekiah's son, apparently didn't learn some good lessons from his dad. I don't know how, I don't know why, he didn't learn. But God declares, because King Manasseh of Judah has done these abhorrent things, he has outdone the wickedness, all that the Amorites, he has outdone in wickedness all that the Amorites did before his time. Amorites were some of the worst among the people that God cast out previously. I am going to bring such disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that both ears of everyone who hears about it will tingle. I will wipe Jerusalem clean as one wipes a dish and turns it upside down. And I will cast off the remnant of my own people. There's something about God being unable to be in the presence of human misbehavior that we find in the Torah. Dr. Tamar Kaminkowski at RRC at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, her new commentary on Leviticus, which isn't as new as it was a few years ago, talks about the idea in Leviticus of trying to avoid pollution, because pollution through misdeed sort of magnetically sticks to the tent of meeting where God's presence is among the people and drives God away. The air quality for God goes down and God has to flee. This theology is different. The air quality for God has gone down, and instead of God fleeing, God is flinging away the problem, which is a rather harsh solution to the problem, and again may have come during the exile, and explaining they got thrown out for their stuff, we got thrown out for our stuff. So Manasseh was the last straw, except then we had at least 6 more kings and 50 more years of kings of Judah. And every single one of those kings is bad, like Manasseh before him, except Josiah. And Josiah ruled for about 30 of those 50 years. And Josiah, we remember, cleaned up. He cleaned out every shrine. He cut down every sacred pole. He broke down every altar. He desecrated everything with human remains, which is the way to utterly desecrate a religious shrine forever. All throughout the land of Israel, all throughout the land of Judah, Josiah was this great, great king, like no one before or after him in the book of Kings. And then 2 Kings 23:26 comes in and says, however, Hashem did not turn away from God's awesome wrath, which had blazed up against Judah because of all the things Manasseh did to vex God. Manasseh is the final straw, but God waited another 50 years for all the pieces to fall into place. Judah, after the death of Josiah specifically, becomes a vassal state to Egypt, because the king of Egypt is the one who killed, or an Egyptian army person killed Josiah. And so Egypt conquers the land and says, all right, whoever's next on the king, that's fine, you can stay on the throne if you're going to pay tribute and behave. And that was all well and good until Babylon showed up at the door. And Babylon said, you know what? We'll take care of the Egyptians for you. Pay us the protection money. And the king did, because he was held at spear point at that point. And you do what the person with the weapon says. And Egypt got upset and carted off one of the kings. And then the next few kings, Babylon ended up carting off. And there's actually several rounds of elites from Jerusalem getting exiled to Babylon. So this 20-year turbulent period from about 605 BCE to 586 BCE, it's very rough time if you're a ruler, if you're a Judean ruler. And for the people, I imagine it was a rough time too, but there's not a whole lot of information in the Book of Kings or the Book of Chronicles about that time. It's retold just very succinctly, like, so-and-so is king, he reigned for 3 months, and he did the evil things the way that his fathers did, and he was carted off to Egypt. So-and-so became king, he reigned for 10 years, he did all the bad things his father did, and he got carted off to Babylon. So-and-so replaced him as king, etc. So the province, the state of Judah at the time, it's sort of halfway one, halfway the other, the way that the empires worked. It was not one that was behaving itself very well, which we know happened again in Jewish history when the Romans were in charge, that the Jewish people revolted against Rome twice. And we end up with Zedekiah, the last king of Judah. Zedekiah suffered a very awful fate. And this story is in Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, as well as the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles. I like the Jeremiah version the best. It has just a bit more detail than the others. The king of Babylon had Zedekiah's sons slaughtered before his eyes. He also had all the officials of Judah slaughtered at Riblah, which was where the king of Babylon was staying at the time. Then the eyes of Zedekiah were put out, and he was chained in bronze fetters. The king of Babylon brought him to Babylon and put him in prison, where he remained to the day of his death. Within the text, within the world of the text, the world the text tells us about, this looks like the execution of the entire Davidic line. Zedekiah is the last king. He sees his sons being slaughtered, all the officials, and then his eyes are put out. That's the last thing he sees. And it's a gut punch. It's a very heavy gut punch, because this eternal promise of kingship has been literally cut down, cut off. And it isn't the exact last thing that happens in the stories, in Chronicles, in Kings, in Jeremiah, but it is this moment when the Davidic monarchy is unquestionably and permanently ended. And there really is a question: did the Davidic line survive? The practice that is reported in our Tanakh, in several books, and in ancient Near Eastern literature, just as a whole, is when you killed the king and the king's sons, you usually hunted down all of the family members of the king. So we reach this moment where there's nothing left. It's the end. It's not the end. There's still a bit more story to tell. These are the last 2 verses of the book of Chronicles. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, when the word of Hashem spoken by Jeremiah was fulfilled, Hashem roused the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia to issue a proclamation throughout his realm by word of mouth and in writing, as follows. Thus said King Cyrus of Persia, Hashem, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has charged me with building God a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Any one of you, of all of Hashem's people, Hashem their God be with them, and let them go up. The temple was destroyed in 586 when the Babylons carted off all the elites of Judah and killed Zedekiah. So the temple was in ruins. And Chronicles ends with this little bit about, but you get to go back and you get to build a new temple. You get to build the second temple. And the book of Ezra and Nehemiah describe that time when the people came back from exile to implement this directive of Cyrus to rebuild the temple. So God's people isn't done. God's temple isn't done. The Davidic line, though, when they come back to start rebuilding the temple, there is not a Davidic king on the throne. They have a governor appointed by the king of Babylon. That first governor is actually Nehemiah, if you prefer, who we have some of his genealogical information, but not enough to really tell if he was or wasn't from any important family. He managed to get himself important enough to be the cupbearer for the king. But it's sort of unknown. We're at the end of the crown. There's a king who survives and basically becomes a pet in Babylon. Before Cyrus comes in, there is a king who notices that one of the Davidic kings, one of the Judean kings, was still in prison, and said, bring him out of prison, dress him up in nice garments. He's even going to sit on a throne higher than all the other pet kings that I have, and I'm going to feed him every day of his life. So he does. That's what happens. That's how the Book of Kings ends, and it's right before what happens at the end of the Book of Chronicles, and it's how the Book of Jeremiah ends, is with that king who's a pet in Babylon. So the end of the Davidic line is a question, because it could have happened, but it seems to have not, and there are people who claimed vehemently that it had not. Several men of royal descent survived into the exile and afterward. No Davidic ruler steps up to reclaim the throne when the exiles return. But members of the House of David may have become governors of the province of Judah or Judea, depending on which empire was controlling it at the time. It could change name between Judah or Yehuda and Judea or Judea. But some of the governors may have been from the Davidic house, but there was no attempt to reinstitute the monarchy. In the Talmud, Ketubot 62b teaches that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was a descendant of David, and therefore so were Hillel and Shimon ben Gamliel, Yehuda Hanassi's ancestors. These are three of the most important rabbis in our Talmud. Hillel founded the school of rabbis that made all the halakhic decisions that were normative in the Talmud for many generations. Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel. Shimon ben Gamliel was the head of the rabbis at the time of forgive me if this is wrong, I believe the right after the Second Temple is destroyed. I don't know if he was in power before then or not, but afterward he is the one who's leading, and he's the head of the rabbis, and a lot of the early rabbinic stories that have a whole lot of fun things like carob trees flying, or the voice of God coming and saying so and so is right, and Rabbi Yehoshua standing up and shouting down God and winning. That was Shimon ben Gamliel, and Gamliel, his son. And Yehuda Hanasi is why we have the Mishnah in written form. He said, write it down. It had been oral only before then. And he said, we have to write it down. We're losing it. We're not going to preserve it by passing it on orally the way that we have. We need to write it down. So we have rabbis who are said to be descendants of David. They're part of the house of David. And those rabbis actually end up being exilarchs, not immediately, but eventually the head of the Jewish community in exile in Babylon area was where the exilarch, the Reish Galuta, which the head of the exile. And those, the exilarchs ended up being rabbis. So there's this blending of rabbi and leader of the community and house of David that just sort of knit together. Perhaps naturally, perhaps because they were from an important family. There are even modern day claims about the house of David. There are some European royal houses that claim to be descended from the house of David. There is a center where they try to track down people who are supposedly of the Davidic line. Because Jewish teaching is that the Messiah is not yet arrived, will come from the house of David. If you are someone who believes that there will be a person who is a Messiah who actually does the political thing of setting up a new state in the land that is currently the modern state of Israel, building a third temple and all sorts of things, which most Reconstructionists don't hold water with, that there will be a person. That's the traditional Jewish teaching. I know Reform Jews as well talk about a messianic era more than a Messiah, at a time when justice will be established. And Christians as well, have some of them place importance in the continuation of the Davidic line, even though they say Jesus was the Messiah and Jesus was in the Davidic line. There are some Christians who still say, well, we're waiting for the Jewish Messiah, who is not the Christian Messiah, to show up and institute a kingdom in that land called Israel, so that Jesus can come back. And that's when the Christian apocalypse begins, is when that happens. And you know, if you had a reasonable claim to it, why wouldn't you claim to be part of the house of David? Like this line of great kings, right? Question, Barbara, or?
Oh, sorry, I thought my mic was muted. Well, considering like Solomon had like 1,000 wives or something, I mean, it's perfectly, anybody could be the line of David, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I guess you have to show your lineage, just like a pedigree dog, right? You got to have your papers.
Yeah. And
so who knows? I mean, how do you can't prove it genetically.
You can't really track it down and prove it genetically. And papers can be fraudulently made from time to time, so like you can't get concrete proof. We also have kings who are Jewish, who come after the Hasmonean dynasty, which came from the Maccabees, the Judah the Maccabee. But that was a family that was in the tribe of Levi. They were Levites. They weren't from the house of David. And the rabbis actually said that the Maccabees, their kingdom went to the ruin at the speed it did, because as Levites they should never have been involved in being in charge. And there are other kings who are the ruler of the area, who are Jewish in some way, shape, or form during the Greco-Roman period. Some of them just happen to be Jewish and get appointed by the government in charge. Some of them are related in Jewish law. They would be considered Jews, even if they themselves wouldn't have considered themselves Jews, because they had a Jewish mother and a Roman father, sort of thing. So there were some more Jewish kings, but nothing where it was like someone was really in power, in charge. It was the king like King Herod in those days, in that territory. You were a vassal king to Rome or whatever imperial government there was. You were a governor. You just had a different title. And if you were king, then presumably you could pass that title on to one of your children. So down comes the crown. So what? And now what?
Good questions.
So here's part of the so what. Did the institution of the Davidic monarchy succeed or fail? The institution of kings. The people asked for a king to make us like all the other nations. And there was this ideal of this king who can execute justice for the people and lead them in battle. Was the institution successful, or was it a failure?
Perhaps it succeeded in some ways and failed in others, just the way this world works. I mean, God made promises to the people of Israel, the Israelite. I'm wondering, wasn't the covenant conditional? That
It was, and the conditions were never met.
So God sort of said, this is what's going to happen to you if you don't do the covenant, and it happened, right?
Right.
So, and God, it's not like God didn't know it was
yeah,
that way, right?
There are big theological questions that this raises, like God picked David because David was a person after God's own heart. That's literally what God says. And then David goes out and has Uriah the Hittite killed so that he can take Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. Like, that doesn't reflect well on God and makes me uncomfortable. Thinking about the theology behind that statement. Yeah, did it succeed or fail is a really interesting question.
And if you have to just select, over the entire period, you have to pick one or the other. I think like it failed. I mean, it seems like the evidence kind of, preponderance of evidence in that direction.
If it was
points in time, it was succeeding. Different leaders were more successful than others, and it succeeded. It seems like it succeeded with some of the other demands.
Yeah.
But not those made by God. So it was.
Yeah.
So it's such a so if that trumps everything else, then no question, it was a failure. But perhaps that's a good thing in a way, right? So that failure means the lesson is that, yeah, that isn't a strategy that matches with this covenant, with the people being really led and protected and sort of ruled by God instead.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so don't go
When
backwards either, right?
when God talks to Samuel and says they've rejected me as their king.
Right.
Well, a lot of the Bible is the prophets.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't have the prophets if the kings didn't screw up. I mean, I love the prophets. I think, this is the thing. I mean, I don't think we know the end of the story. And until we do, it's always going to be six of one, half a dozen the other, because, God made his covenant with the people. And these people so that means even, down to the smallest child has to, follow the covenant. And no matter who sits above them, or,
Yeah.
they're all going to fail. It's not, we're all going to fail. We're all going to fail. So, right.
Yeah.
So there's no getting around that. And so you have to figure somehow this story is going somewhere, whether Israel in the future has kings again. I mean, the modern world is not looking good for king crowns of anywhere.
No.
I mean, look at that teetering English monarchy over there. The corrupt as long as the day is long. And they're not even the House of Windsor. They had to change their names from their German names during World War I, because Germans weren't real popular in England. So
No, they were not very popular at the time. No.
So I mean, and that's not it's the least of the problems with kingship and royalty, especially in the modern world. The modern world, we won't stand for that kind of thing. That's just an old relic that proves what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So
and isn't the corruption also, it's sort of really concentrated within the monarchy as well, and less so like in the modern period.
Yes,
Somewhat less so among just like the regular people, many of whom, in fact, are following the covenant to this day, and not so, not so involved in a lot of the other things that really added up as the corruption as well.
Yeah.
And we don't get to hear a lot about. I mean, there were the different references you made to behaviors of sort of the common person during the time, but most of it's really focused on really like the highest leader too, not even whether it's within the monarchy, right? Or or anything else. We're mostly hearing just about the king.
Yeah. The king stands in for the people in some ways in these stories.
And not like there isn't all manner of hyperbole everywhere also, right? So some of the things that were so corrupt, etc., who knows?
Yeah. I'm going to take the sharing down because that was our last slide. And so having been through this study, we've talked about kings. We've talked about the institution of kingship. We've talked about these books in our Tanakh, the history, the theologies, the different points of view that they have. What are your takeaways? What are you walking away from this class with? What has changed in your understanding? What is something that you appreciate now more than you used to? I wish more of our fellow travelers had been able to join us this evening to get more input from all of them. But what have you gained from this?
Well, obviously, you know a lot about this period of time that most people don't really want to spend time on. And so I want to thank you for doing the work, the deep dive, because I guess it's one of the least looked at that in Leviticus, right? No, I don't know.
At
You
least we
know,
read Leviticus, in the Torah.
yeah, I mean, I, you know, I, I just think it's, foundational stories are very important just in their own, for their own sake, but it shows you the trajectory of it. It's all about human nature and God. And, just because it happened, God knows how long ago, it doesn't mean it's not playing out before our very eyes today.
Yeah.
And I mean, I remember reading Kings and Chronicles, but like, as a teenager. So I don't think I've read them ever since, to be honest. So this was a wonderful opportunity to sort of revisit that as an adult, and also, you pulled out the various pieces, which also really turned it into a story, which made it very appealing and very, you could easily follow it. Because
Yeah.
I'm sure, besides the fact that I was using a teenager mind, I don't really, like, I don't think that I thought at the end of that, wow, that was really like the whole king idea really didn't work for Israel. I don't think that's what I walked away with
Yeah.
previously. And then
Yeah.
so since then, it's kind of only been like, I can remember Steve making a couple comments or whatever, just sort of, yeah, that plan just didn't work for the Jews. This was a much more rich version of that. I I definitely still am trying to sort around in my head the part, where God is saying, and then you will have your line will be on the throne forever. And sort of because, you really stayed more with the covenant, really stayed more with what was asked of you. And yet all the evidence sort of suggests no, that wasn't really at all what happened. And in fact, the whole sort of
Yeah.
institution of the monarchy does fail. And yet, if you kind of think of that as a, like on an individual level, similar things, like sometimes you're trying out stuff or you're going in a path and you kind of realize, oh wow, that like I did everything possibly wrong that I maybe could have done wrong, or I did enough wrong that I've convinced myself that wasn't the path or whatever. And yet still, here we are left to continue to be Jews,
Yeah.
continue to pursue this despite all the, like, every terrible thing. Like Alicia loves all these, all the shows on TV. I'm not a TV watcher at all, but when they're always, somebody's always killing somebody, there's all manner of corruption, whatever. I can barely stand to watch it. And yet, through all these stories, it's the same kind of stuff. But that message, I mean, so maybe that's my key takeaway, that message of, even when things are really, really screwed up, God did not leave the Jewish people. We're still figuring out how to stay true to all of that.
Yeah.
Maybe every day, every individual, every day. And we still are sort of on the throne too. Like, we still have that chance to be
Yeah.
connected to the divine, even with all our human failings, our individual and communal failings. It's,
Yeah.
And really, like, pretty amazingly long, in terms of historically, and deep in terms of all the different things that were done wrong. And yet still, here we are getting the chance to still keep trying to figure it out.
Yeah. I mean, reading these stories, I can see ancient people trying to explain how things are the way they are based on what they know of their history and what their theology tells them.
Right.
And it's incredibly interesting to see their thought patterns come through in their writing. Because these books were written by humans. There's no question about divine authorship. Like, these were written by groups of people for specific reasons.
And time, and that, like, when they sort of stopped and then revisited. I mean, it's,
And they had competing ideas and competing notions. And some of the notions that the people writing these stories and editing these stories had were profoundly impactful in our world in ways we can't even imagine. because it was not really until the people went into exile that Babylon's carted everyone off, killed Zedekiah's sons and carted everyone off. And when the people came back, something had changed. There was a Torah scroll that Ezra read. There was a whole scroll. It might have not been the whole thing that we have in our form today, but there was a scroll. There was also a monotheism that had not existed before. In the Book of Kings, we get a little snippet here and there of Hezekiah tries to institute it, but doesn't get all of the shrines. And Josiah institutes it, but his son comes along and messes it up straight away, right again. And like the idea that there's one God worthy of worship, technically henotheism, not monotheism, but it's that monotheistic impulse. It starts somewhere, it goes into exile, and when it comes back much stronger as monotheism, as this, there is one God, not there's one God worthy of worship, there is one God. And yeah, this is an incredibly interesting time. And as a biblical scholar, I love looking at it. I love looking at these stories, love looking at this time. I thank you for joining me on this journey.
Thank you for doing all of that work and making it so that the rest of us who can't quite
and
dip in at that level could really get a chance to see and hear it and think about it.
The people who were down with the crown and like wholehearted, yes, gung-ho, and the people telling the story hundreds of years later, knowing what happens, just write into every single thing, down with the crown, exclamation point. Take it down. It doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. We're in exile. Even Chronicles, well, we came back from exile, but we still don't have a king because the king doesn't work. Which, if people had listened to that story in the medieval period, we might have very different forms of government today.
A lot of generations of horribleness there.
Yeah, and there are some timeless lessons we learn from these things. Like don't pick your leader based on height or based on perceived qualities, but based on their actions. And that's why Hezekiah and Josiah are put forth as the best kings, because they acted in the right way. So
I know you're trying to end this, but I see parallels between what you talked about Israel. Which Israel? The idealized Israel with the glorious promises of the Bible versus the reality.
Yeah.
This has all shades of that as well.
Yeah,
and there's that tension in the Bible of this glorious promises of the future and the Messiah and all that. And then here we are dragging ourselves through the mud, I mean, I don't know what to do with that tension.
The rabbis deal with that same tension. The early rabbis who are in the Mishnah, who are in the Talmud, deal with that same tension. It's a tension that is, it persists, because where we can hope and dream always will exceed where we can reach. And it's comforting to know that we aren't the first generation of people, or generations, if you prefer, of people to deal with this. It has been going on as long as we have been writing stories.
Yeah, definitely.
And so I'm down with the crown because of all the things about down with the crown.
We're down with the crown.
That we learn. Like, I love having these things in my past. So
yeah, thank you. That's
thank
great.
you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, be sure to send the recording to those who didn't get to see the last part, because I really
will
want to hear how the story ended.
Yeah, I will.
All right. Thanks, John.